Chapter 5, The Organization of Evil, Number 2. There are people who claim to be Satanists and who are abusing children. We know it. David Austin, Satanist, May 1989. On Wednesday, 12 August 1987, Kelly was standing near her mother and stepfather at the PX store on the U.S. Army Presidio base in San Francisco. Kelly was the frightened 3-year-old girl we met in Chapter 2. Her stepfather, Larry, worked as a chaplain at the Presidio, and she had attended the daycare center within its compound. Suddenly, Kelly ran across to Larry and clutched his leg. She refused to let go and seemed terrified. The cause of her panic was standing just a few yards across the store, a stocky, middle-aged man with a strange haircut and curiously raised eyebrows. "Do you know that man?" Larry asked her. Kelly peered out from behind his leg, but stayed quiet. Larry called to her mother, Michelle, to come over to where they were standing. With his wife beside Kelly, he asked again, "Do you know him?" This time Kelly spoke. "Yes," she said, "that's Mikey." Larry and Michelle hurried their daughter out of the store. By their car, Kelly stopped and said, "He's a bad man and I'm afraid." Larry bundled her into the back seat and drove the car around to the other side of the PX and towards the exit from the base. On the sidewalk, he spotted a striking woman with jet black hair and dramatically applied makeup. He stopped the car, pointed to the woman, and asked Kelly, "Do you know her?" "Yes," she replied, "that's Shambi." That Larry and Michelle were not unduly surprised by Kelly's revelations was due to the events of the previous 10 months. Late in November 1986, a 3-year-old boy came home from the Presidio daycare center and told his parents Mr. Gary had sexually abused him. He was terrified and begged his mother not to send him back to the facility. In December, FBI agents arrested Gary Willard Hambright, a 33-year-old daycare worker at the Presidio Center. By the end of 1986, Hambright, who had previously been ordained as a Southern Baptist minister, was charged with sodomy, oral copulation, and committing a lewd and lascivious act on the boy. He denied all the allegations. A series of medical tests began in January 1987, not only on the 3-year-old boy, though examination confirmed that he had been abused, but on an ever-increasing number of other youngsters at the daycare center who now found the courage to tell their parents what had happened. Initial estimates put the likely numbers of victims at between 58 and 60. All were under 4 years old when the abuse took place. Most were suffering from nightmares and terrors. At least 6 had the venereal disease chlamydia. Kelly was one of more than 100 preschool children at the center questioned by the FBI. Larry had heard in January about the investigation. It appeared to connect with the nightmares in bedwetting Kelly had begun the previous September. He also remembered several occasions when, picking her up from the center, Gary Hambright met him with the girl's soiled pants in his hand and an explanation that she had wet them during the day. Larry had been puzzled. Kelly hadn't wet her pants, except recently at night, for more than a year. At first, Kelly made only vague, indefinite statements to her federal detectives. Nonetheless, something in her manner worried them. In February, she began therapy sessions with an expert child sex abuse counselor. After 4 visits, Kelly, unprompted, began to talk about being abused. The case against Gary Hambright took a turn for the worse the following month. Neither the police, therapists, nor parents wanted the 3-year-old boy to give evidence in open court. U.S. law worked against them by insisting that a child's testimony could only be held valid if he or she could tell the difference between fantasy and reality. The usual test was whether the child believed in Father Christmas. U.S. Attorney Joseph Rusoniello decided that his only hope lay in persuading the trial judge to relax the the strict federal laws on hearsay evidence and to allow the boy's parents and counselor to testify on oath about what he had said and who he had identified as his abuser. On 4 March, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer refused the request. He said he had no alternative since the hearsay rule had been established to protect the innocent. 3 weeks later, Rusoniello filed for the dismissal of all charges against Hambright. It was a difficult decision, he said, but we were forced to make it. We had no choice. Schwartzer ordered that the case be dropped without prejudice, a legal nicety meaning that it could be revived if new evidence was brought forward. Rusoniello set to work. Early reports from the therapists working with the other Presidio children indicated that many were naming Mr. Gary as their abuser and subsequently identifying Hambright as Mr. Gary. By August, the attorney was able to announce that the former Southern Baptist minister was, quote, the prime suspect for the multiple molestations, even though tests showed that he did not exhibit symptoms of chlamydia. On 1 October 1987, Hambright was indicted by a federal grand jury on 10 counts of performing lewd acts on boys and girls aged between 2 and 5, plus 2 further counts of oral copulation with 2 of the victims. Rusoniello was, however, facing a new problem with the case. Although the number of children involved was 58, not all clearly identified Hambright. Some, like Kelly, named both him and other adults. Worse still, the nature of the abuse allegations was changing before his eyes. Kelly had identified Hambright from a police photo lineup on the morning of 13 August. She told FBI Special Agent Clyde Foreman that the man in the picture was called Mr. Gary and that he had put his penis in her anus, vagina, and mouth. All that happened at the daycare center, but there was more to follow. Quote, victim states that she drove with Mr. Gary to his house where he took photos of her. Mikey and Shamby were present and Mikey put his penis into her mouth, bottom, and vagina, just like Mr. Gary. Victim stated that Mikey and Mr. Gary dressed up in girls' clothing and Shamby dressed up in boys' clothing. Victim states that the house had a bathtub with lion's feet, close quote. Kelly's disclosure matched what she had said to her parents outside the Presidio PX store the previous day. Mikey was a bad man, and she was afraid. Mikey was Michael Aquino. Shamby was his wife, Lilith. Nor was Kelly's disclosure, the first of many, unique. Several other children known to be victims of abuse at the Presidio Daycare Center had identified a Mikey and a Shamby as 2 of their abusers. Most claimed that they had been driven off the base and made to take part in what were clearly rituals. Over the next 2 days, Kelly provided the FBI with apparently strong testimony. She was able to identify, unprompted, one of the houses to which she had been taken. The address was 2430 Leavenworth in San Francisco's charmingly expensive Russian Hills district. The registered occupants, Michael and Lilith Aquino. Inside the house, Kelly insisted there was a room with black walls and a cross painted on the ceiling. On 14 August, San Francisco's municipal court authorized a search warrant of 2430 Leavenworth. The same afternoon, Inspector Glenn Palmdeloff, a child abuse specialist within San Francisco's juvenile unit, led a raid on the house. He took away a large number of video and audio tapes, notebooks, address books, photo albums, negatives, and a computer. They took away 29 photographs of costumes, masks, and stars. He also confirmed one crucial fact. The Aquino's living room was painted entirely black. The Aquino's, like Hambright, denied any knowledge of the physical abuse and insisted that none of the Temple of Set's rituals involved children. Michael Aquino said that neither he nor his wife had ever met Gary Hambright. The FBI and San Francisco police kept their own counsel. The Aquinos were not charged with any offense. But Rossoniello and his team knew that a number of very young children, with medical evidence to back up some of their claims, were disclosing identical details of ritual abuse at the hands of Mikey, Shamby, and Mr. Gary. The stories involved bizarre, if potentially possible, ceremonies with chanting, the eating of feces, and the drinking of blood or urine, together with apparently impossible allegations that the abuse had happened in a place where sharks lived. What concerned him was that the children evidently believed these implausible parts of their testimony, and that each independently confirmed the other. The prosecuting team decided to use the resurrected case against Hamburg to test the water. If the system could deliver a successful prosecution against the former minister, then a case might be possible against Satan's representative on earth. On 1 February 1988, the case against Hamburg collapsed again. There had been, since the previous month, a steady reduction in the number of charges he faced as parent after parent withdrew their children from the prosecution stand on advice from psychologists that the trial might cause untreatable trauma for the youngsters. Mike and Joyce Tobin, parents of the 3-year-old boy whose allegations sparked the original investigation, were the last to give in. They did so reluctantly. Quote, "My concern has been for my son's welfare," close quote. Captain Tobin told reporters afterwards, quote, "That has been my number one concern in this case, and I think this withdrawal is in my and my family's best interests," close quote. In the few cases left where parents agreed to continue, Judge Schwartzer ruled that their children's testimony was not specific enough as to dates, times, and places. Some of the victims could only give a loose time scale, ranging from several weeks to several months, for the abuse they suffered. Rossoniello insisted that the case was far from over and that investigations would continue. But on 20 June, he was forced to call a halt to the 19-month federal inquiry. He bitterly criticized the federal legal system for barring children's testimony. Quote, "The system failed the parents and the children," close quote, he told a news conference, and gave the first formal stamp of approval to the allegations of ritual abuse. Quote, "I was satisfied in my own mind after a review of the evidence, both admissible and inadmissible, that these acts did occur to these children, but there is no reasonable likelihood that further investigative effort would have developed evidence to support a criminal prosecution," close quote. The best that Rossoniello could have offered the parents was a promise that the file would remain open if inactive. But the parents had other ideas. They began a multiple negligence suit against the U.S. Army worth a minimum of $66 million. While Michael Aquino smiled with relief at the collapse of a case which could have led to his arraignment by a grand jury, a case was building that would ultimately lead to a formal recording of ritual abuse being entered on his record. The Aquinos were not, however, taking any chances. From very early in the investigations, the couple had invited network television cameras into their home, both to give interviews and to record for broadcast the interior decor of a satanic temple. The result, whether intended or not, was that all future testimony against the couple, which cited as corroboration children's recollections of the black-walled room, would be devalued. After all, the children could have seen pictures on the screen. Only Kelly's disclosure, which predated the open house policy, was uncontaminated. The move was typical of Aquino. Despite his deliberately cultivated appearance, he looks like a cast member from the 1960s spoof horror series, The Addams Family. Aquino is a dangerously clever man. His training in psychological operations and warfare has left him with a disturbing ability to remain icily calm under the most extreme pressure. It is a facade he uses as a weapon in interviews with both journalists and detectives. His wife Lilith is strikingly different. 5 years older than her husband. She is 50. Lilith Sinclair was, until she met Aquino, a professional model from New Jersey. Temple of Set records do not reveal whether Lilith was her first name prior to being elevated to the Satanic priesthood. Either way, it appears a curious coincidence. In medieval Jewish folklore, Lilith was Adam's first wife, who turned into a demon after the creation of Eve. Some etymologists suggest that the name means child stealer. The couple make an odd pair. Lilith, heavily make-upped and dramatically dressed, is aggressive, volatile, and fiery. Aquino is the exact opposite, calm, calculating, and cerebral. The contrast was made clear when the Aquinos took part in a networked chat show hosted by Oprah Winfrey in February 1988. Michael Aquino was evidently in complete control of his feelings. His wife lashed out verbally at those who dared suggest that ritual abuse ever took place. But the tranquility restored to the Temple of Set after the failure of the federal Presidio case against Gary Hambright was to be short-lived. Prompted by the affidavit submitted by parents of the abused children, the Army quietly began its own investigation into the Aquinos. The Criminal Investigation Command of the Sixth Army, based at the Presidio, appointed a small team under the Judge Advocate General. It started in November 1988 to sift through the several hundred disclosure documents and notes of therapy sessions. Soon it had sorted out a handful which looked interesting. Quote, "We had about 6 cases we thought looked strong enough for us to mount something against Michael Aquino. This would have been purely an Army case, no criminal charges or anything like that, just the lever to have him dismissed. We began trying to interview the children. Some of the parents didn't want us to put their kids through all that again, so we were denied access. But other cases came forward and we added them to our list. In addition to the original complainant, Kelly, we found a number of children were independently identifying both Michael and Lilith Aquino as their abusers. They talked typically about being abused within a group, in the dark room, and with chanting going on. The usual things described were sodomy and oral sex, the eating of feces, and the drinking of blood. But some of the kids were more detailed. They said that Lilith, Shambi, they called her, was more cruel, less controlled than Mikey. We were careful, too, about the way we progressed the case. In one instance, we thought we should test just how well the kids were able to recognize and identify Michael Aquino. So we made a video of several actors who were made to look like him and sound like him. Then we got them to read out bits of a transcript of Aquino's remarks on the Oprah Winfrey Show and edited them all alongside the real thing. When we showed the kids the video, Identity Parade, they picked out Aquino as Mikey every time. Close quote. One of the cases that came to the Army investigators was that of Debbie's 2 sons. As we saw in Chapter 2, the boys, both of whom were removed several hundred miles away from San Francisco immediately after the abuse was disclosed, told the investigators that they had been taken from the Presidio base to a number of locations throughout the Bay Area. They were able to identify and show the team each site. They described in detail and with evident distress many of the classic key indicators of ritual abuse. They too were able to identify Mikey and Shambi. Quote, "The Army investigators came and questioned our children. They did photo lineups and the boys pointed out both Michael and Lilith Aquino. The kids told them about rituals they had been involved in where there were robes, candles, chanting, and sometimes masks. They had to drink blood, they had to drink urine, they had to eat feces. They had to molest other children and have sex with all kinds of different adults. Almost every time, as the boys said, Mr. Aquino was there. The children said they had been at a daycare center where he was, and they also told the Army they had been in his house and disclosed what the inside of his house looked like. They also said they weren't the only children involved. There were lots of others, too. My kids were adamant that they were videotaped during some of these rituals. Pornography appears to be a really big part of this. And they talked about the drugs, lots and lots of them at the rituals, and they even shot the kids up with them. The boys said they were made to eat some ice cream one time, and after that, they didn't want to eat ice cream again because they remembered what had happened to them before. It gave them a kind of sick feeling and made them sleepy. Then they were abused. Close quote. Case after case from states throughout America poured in. Some of the judge advocate's team discarded as inherently implausible or simply outbursts of hysteria and bandwagon jumping. Others were carefully added to the files, particularly if they came from an independent source. Cynthia Angel is a lawyer working in the small Northwest California town of Red Bluff, a picturesque and sleepy community 200 miles north of San Francisco. A quiet, petite woman who works a joint practice with her husband on the town's one major shopping street, Angel had never come across Satanism or handled a ritual abuse case until the beginning of 1988. Quote, that January, I became involved in a civil lawsuit. I represented a man who was fighting his ex-wife for custody of his children, a 5-year-old boy and his 3-year-old sister. Sometime into the proceedings, the children showed evidence that they had been sexually abused. The little girl, in particular, showed medical signs that were consistent with an object being forced inside her vagina. She had 2 lacerations inside her vagina, and the pediatricians said there was no possibility of them being self-inflicted since they would have caused extreme pain. Her brother showed strong psychological signs of a severe traumatization, and it gradually emerged in counseling that both had been ritually abused. They started describing horrendous acts that they had been forced to take part in. They had sex with animals. They described being forced to drink blood. They also talked about witnessing people being killed and having their blood drained from them. The children had been at the Presidio Daycare Center, and so I began asking about the facility there. I was vaguely aware that there had been allegations of ritual abuse at the center, but I couldn't be sure that the abuse these children described to their therapist actually took place there. Close quote. One reason for Angel's uncertainty as to the precise location where the children were assaulted was contained in their disclosures. Both were convinced that they had been taken to implausible or downright impossible places prior to being abused. A dungeon, a jungle, even an airplane. Angel did not know it, but the youngsters' disclosures matched both those from other Presidio victims and the national pattern of children's testimony. The lawyer's job was made harder by her difficulty in gaining access to the children. Their mother initially refused to allow them to talk to any more specialists. But Angel was told by a friend of the family that the youngsters had named or identified to their therapist a large number of adults who had abused them. One name in particular rang a bell. Quote, the kids said a man called Michael Kino was present and involved in the ceremonies they had been forced to attend. They told their mother this, and since I had made inquiries about the Presidio and come up with the name of Michael Aquino, I asked the mother to confirm the details. She refused, and so I was left having to call as witness, when the case went to trial, the person who had reported the disclosure in the first place. Simultaneously, I made formal inquiries about issuing a subpoena to get Michael Aquino in court and on the stand. I have no way of knowing if he genuinely was involved in the abuse. I do know, however, that the children were in the Presidio Daycare Center and identified someone who appeared to be him. The case was due to go to start on 1 February 1989. The night before that first hearing, I got a telephone call from a woman who was going to be a key witness. She asked me to meet her at a restaurant on the main street here in Red Bluff because she had some important information for me. I agreed, got in my car, and drove downtown. When I got to the restaurant, she wasn't there. But before I could even get out of the car, 2 men got in through the passenger side. One pointed a gun at my head and told me to drive out of town. I was made to drive about 4 miles out of town, and at that point I was blindfolded and put into a second car and driven somewhere else. During the course of this kidnapping, which lasted about 3 hours in total, I was told that I was investigating things that I shouldn't be investigating, and that if I continued with it, I would be killed. Close quote. To ram home this threat, the men showed Angel a photograph and played her a sound recording on the car stereo. Both made an indelible impression on her, and recalling the incident even weeks later was clearly traumatic. Angel's voice cracked and shook. There were pauses in her narrative as she fought to force down tears. Quote, the picture was of a naked infant. Its skin had been partially peeled away, and the men made it clear that the children had been killed in a satanic ritual. The tape seemed to back this up. It contained children's voices, children crying, and adults chanting. The chanting was not articulate. I mean, I couldn't tell you what they said, but the men made it clear that this was a satanic ritual and that I should stop investigating Satanism if I wanted to stay alive. They also said that if I told anyone what I saw that night, or if I reported the kidnapping to the authorities, they would surely kill me. I was terrified, of course, but I felt I had to report it and I had to carry on with the case. Close quote. Angel contacted both her local state police and the Army investigators involved in the Presidio case. To the former, she gave a full account of the kidnapping and a detailed description of her abductors. The resulting photo fit make one thing quite clear. Neither man was Michael Aquino. Yet Angel was left in absolutely no doubt that the cause of her ordeal was the evidence of satanic ritual she had been about to introduce into the custody hearing. The Army detectives, however, were less surprised than Angel had expected. They already, and quite independently, had the children in the case listed as ritual abuse victims at the Presidio Daycare Center, and the man they were ready to accuse was Michael Aquino. Aquino himself, and not surprisingly, was denying any involvement in any criminal activity whatsoever. Quote, the Temple of Set is not an evil religion. We have very much the same standards of morality that the general man on the street would have. We absolutely do not advocate any criminal behavior at all. Quote, in the particular instance of the child abuse allegations against us, I think this is an example of the kind of difficulty that a religion like ours has to put up with. In the United States, there has been an epidemic of rather hysterical accusations of child abuse centering around daycare centers for some years. It started in 1983 with claims about McMartin Preschool in Los Angeles, a case we shall examine in Chapter 7, and a number of copycat cases erupted afterwards. In one of them, a U.S. Army chaplain made an accusation of child abuse centering on Presidio at the time when Lilith and I were living 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C. Close quote. Aquino's manner and tone of voice when answering allegations of ritual child abuse is invariably patient and painstaking, deliberately giving the impression of wary resignation at having to respond to such absurd and demeaning claims. There is, however, a chink in the Aquino armor. His statements are frequently inaccurate and misleading in small details. The Army chaplain to whom he refers was Kelly's stepfather, Larry, yet it was Kelly herself who made the allegations about Mikey and Shamby, and indeed identified them as Aquino and Lilith. He has also claimed in other interviews that at the time at which the majority of the abuse took place, he was based not in Washington, D.C., but in St. Louis, Missouri. Either way, argue Army investigators, his duties were in the Army Reserve, and therefore he was largely free to come and go as he pleased. Subsequent counterclaims made by the Aquinos in interviews over the allegations involved the ritual abuse at Presidio are refuted by Army investigators or San Francisco police documents. Quote, Aquino, Kelly was stated by her stepfather to have been sodomized and raped, but the child has been examined by the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and the child is completely untouched. Army response: a direct lie. The medical evidence shows she was sexually abused. Aquino: the chaplain, Kelly's father, made a deliberately false and malicious statement, and I have filed court-martial charges against him, which are under investigation at this time, May of 1989. Army response: the complaint Aquino filed was dismissed in 1988. A subsequent allegation he asked to be investigated in the summer of 1989 was also dismissed. Aquino: Kelly did not identify the house where the abuse took place, nor did she say that there was a room painted in black with a cross on the ceiling. Instead, the chaplain told police that this is what she said. Close quote. But San Francisco Police Report number 870910025, 1 September 1987, records, quote, on Thursday, August 13th, 1987, FBI Special Agent Clyde Foreman interviewed victim Kelly, who stated that Mr. Gary, whom she identified from a photo spread, had placed his penis into her bottom, vagina, and mouth. Mikey and Shamby were present, and that Mikey also put his penis into her mouth, bottom, and vagina, just like Mr. Gary. On Friday, August 14th, Foreman re-interviewed the victim, who stated that she was filmed with a movie camera with steady lights, and that the living room had black walls and a cross painted on the ceiling, close quote. Whenever the Aquinos had given interviews, and they have deliberately sought out the media since Kelly's initial allegations, they have made small but potentially significant errors in their stories. Each of these were carefully recorded by the Army investigators. Each went into a file with the name Michael Aquino stamped on the front in black letters inside a stark box. The identification tag for that box read, quote, name of suspect, close quote. Aquino, meanwhile, decided to go on the offensive. In addition to giving as many interviews as he could, he launched a recruiting drive for the Temple of Set. His chosen target was Britain. In the summer of 1988, a British neo-pagan magazine published an article by Aquino entitled Horns Across the Water: Satanism in Britain and America. The magazine was The Lamp of Thoth, published by the occultist businessman Christopher Bray, and the most widely distributed of all such periodicals. Aquino's article took the form of a rallying call to British devil worshippers, an invitation to join forces in the worship of what he chose to call, quote, the Prince of Darkness, close quote. Quote, it is difficult to say why British and American Satanist movements haven't interacted more with one another. The two principal American satanic movements, the Temple of Set and its forerunner, the Church of Satan, both inherited key components of their symbolism and ritual practices from British occult predecessors. Since these groups have enjoyed 22 years of success in the US and Canada, it would seem natural that we would have developed overseas contacts in the UK, close quote. With the exception of a few isolated memberships, such cross-fertilizations never took place. Contemporary America's first taste of British Satanism came from the US publication in the 1960s of 3 of Dennis Wheatley's satanic novels. Wheatley borrowed liberally from Golden Dawn / Argentium Astrum, Crowley's Order of the Silver Star. His Satanists were elegant, powerful, mysterious, and insidiously successful in whatever they wanted to do. This was a powerful aphrodisiac for certain American occultists who were impatient with parlor esoterica. And there's a footnote here. It is worth remembering Aquino's view of Wheatley's influence, since much of the criticism of those who accept the reality of ritual abuse is that they have been, quote, reading too much Dennis Wheatley stuff, close quote. Evidently, the well-researched basis of his novels proved a powerful stimulant for early American Satanists. The Church of Satan borrowed more atmosphere than substance from Wheatley. Although the Black Mass was included in the church's ceremonial inventory, it consisted of highly stylized psychodrama rather than ritual murder, crucified bats, or turnip attacks on virgins, close quote. The history lesson over, Aquino drew his readership towards the new satanic movement set up to replace the Church of Satan, the Temple of Set. Quote, from its founding, it has endeavored to apprehend and incorporate the principle of what Judeo-Christian culture caricatures as Satanists from all cultures and philosophical patterns of thought. While there are local groups, pylons, within the temple, similar to the old Church of Satan's grottos, the term LaVey coined for individual lodges, the temple is configured to function primarily on an interpersonal basis. Most of its members are geographically remote from one another, so our administrative services emphasize maximum use of the postal services. This would seem to be an ideal situation for international interaction with the UK. Each year, the temple holds a conclave where initiates can meet for business, fellowship, and magical workings. Although our autumn 1988 conclave is already set for Toronto, we are thinking of London for the autumn of 1989 event. It would be pleasant indeed to share this adventure with fellow Satanists from those magical islands in the North Sea, which can justly claim to be one of the world's true centers of civilization. We would like to see the Temple of Set become truly international. And if British Satanists yearn for the elegant malevolence of Dennis Wheatley's Mokata, a satanic high priest, well, we shall try not to disappoint them in that regard either. Close quote. Christopher Bray appended a contract address where would-be British Satanists could apply to the Temple of Set for affiliation or membership, and many did. Aquino's leaden prose had managed to obscure the fact that the Temple of Set already existed within the UK, albeit on a small scale. Its most senior member was a former Church of Satan follower and gay chef called David Austin, a tubby, apparently genial man in his early 30s. Austin was subsequently raised to the rank of high priest and British representative of the temple. It was his task to evaluate requests for membership from UK Satanists. One such came from a 14-year-old schoolboy in the Cambridgeshire town of Peterborough. Quote, Me fratrari, having recently read an article in Lamp of Thoth from the Sorcerer's Apprentice, I write to you asking for information concerning your order. I am 14 years of age and a student at Oundle, a celebrated English public school. I have looked into LaVey's Satanism and performed to date only one Black Mass. I am intending to use Satanism as the system for some chaoist workings, close quote. Chaos, spelled Khaos, was a wild and random magical system, heavily promoted at the time through Chris Bray's Sorcerer's Apprentice bookshop, which involved drawing in bits of any number of different pagan beliefs and rituals in the hope of creating something exciting. To his credit, Austin recommended refusing membership to an adolescent boy. Some of the temple ceremonies would have required him to take part in ritual or group sex, and the age of consent for homosexuality in Britain is 21. In fact, Austin is remarkably frank about the nature of Satanism, its rituals, and the activities of some of its adherents. Quote, our outlook differs in many ways from non-Satanists. On the subject of morals, for instance, we believe that everything we have, food, wine, our bodies, are there to be enjoyed as the individual sees fit, but in a responsible manner. They themselves draw the guidelines. The law, however, prohibits us from actually proselytizing to those underage. Some of our rites are sexually oriented, and in some we have bisexual approach. The black magician looks on sex, like anything else, as a tool, a means to an end. There are, however, many people purporting to be Satanists who just play around with it. People who don't really know what they're doing, they're just in it for a quick leg over. And there are people who claim to be Satanists and who are abusing children. We know it. The trouble is that we, by orientation, have to be a secret order. And there are those that know about the child abuse but will not speak out because they fear magical retribution or even something a bit stronger and perhaps physical. Equally, I have heard of cases of human sacrifice, but in general, it's very difficult to separate truth from fiction, and I would prefer not to believe it's true. I have never actually seen a living sacrifice, though I have been credited by the press as having seen one. I have seen mock incidents where it is done for the camera, but I have never honestly been present at one. Close quote. Austin's forthright acceptance of the reality of ritual abuse has earned him few friends in the occult community, but he has consistently refused to believe that his spiritual mentor, Michael Aquino, could himself be guilty. As a result, he set about the temple's membership drive with enthusiasm, and within 6 months of the Lamp of Thoth clarion call, had attracted more than 30 new initiates. To reward him, Aquino flew to Britain to conduct a ceremony of inauguration. David Austin became Britain's first high priest of the Temple of Set in May 1989. Aquino continued to deny the allegations of ritual child abuse, energetically denouncing them completely, if not typically calmly, in an interview during that visit. Quote, "It is malice against our religion and against our church. There may also be an element of personal greed because of the staggering amount of claims that have been ventured against the U.S. government. The Pentagon had indicated that it would accept some of the $66 million negligence claims brought by the Presidio parents for their children's abuse. There is an industry which has been flourishing now for a couple of years, which seeks to profit out of the child molestation scares at daycare centers. There are large government grants to be gained by therapists who succeed in terrifying parents into thinking that their children have been abused. There are reputations to be made by prosecutors who jump upon these cases to move them forward. There have been a great many innocent people, many of whom have absolutely nothing to do with Satanism, who have had their lives and reputations ruined because of this epidemic. The parents have had their lives wrecked just for the malicious satisfaction of a relative few who seek to profit from these things. You have a terrible witch hunt going on, and it's a witch hunt in the classical sense. We do not advocate anything evil. We never have. We have never stood for that, and why would anyone want to do evil in our name escapes me. If it's a question of making a public statement, here we are to make it. We do not advocate child molestation. We do not advocate evil of any sort. We do not advocate anything which is destructive or criminal or degenerate. Close quote. How, then, to explain the quite clear disclosures by the many of the Presidio children to their therapists, which placed both Michael and Lilith Aquino in satanic ceremonies involving severe sexual abuse? What of the curiously timed threats made to Cynthia Angel and the circumstances of her abduction? Lilith Aquino pointed a blood-red fingernail and spat out her answer. Quote, "It's that kind of stuff, which is causing all the misery. These are the kids of people who are actually abusing these children. They take these children, they put them into therapy, they drag them through all kinds of lurid sexual details that they indoctrinate them with. You have a young child who will come out of that experience destroyed, psychologically messed up, and they are the true abuser. These are the people who should be investigated." Close quote. The videotape of that interview shows an expression of pure venom on Lilith Aquino's face. that the Presidio children had unequivocal medical evidence proving the sadistic sexual abuse they had undergone appeared not to matter. When the Aquinos made their trip to Britain and used it to make a public defense of their religion, they were confident that the investigative process was all but over. The FBI and San Francisco police departments had, after all, been forced to abandon all criminal charges based on the Presidio children's evidence. Surely the Army would be forced to follow suit. But the day after they returned to America, the Army handed Michael Aquino a copy of their files. The Judge Advocate General's team had decided to use a process known as titling to deal with the case. Quote, what that means is that we title Aquino as the most likely perpetrator of a particular offense. In this case, the sexual abuse of Kelly. It is a procedural device under Army law that formally records our view that he was responsible for the crime. His name is now entered in our records as the perpetrator. We don't have to do anything about it. In fact, we aren't going to force a court-martial in this case. There are two reasons for that. The first is that it would not be good for the kids to have to go to court now and be cross-examined. The second is simply that his secondment to the regular Army is ending. We just won't review his contract, so in effect, we are getting rid of him that way. Of course, it's open to Aquino to go to court and make us go through a full legal process. In some ways, I hope he does, because if so, he'll have to pay the legal costs, and we are confident of winning. Our investigation showed that he definitely did abuse Kelly. On the others, we haven't reached a verdict, because we don't need to. If he wants to lift that formal recording, then he'll have to sue. I look forward to seeing them in court, close quote.